Hello, and welcome to another episode of Philosophy for Flourishing. I'm joined today by my colleague John Hersey and our special guest, Eric Daniels, who is the Assistant Director at the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. Dr. Daniels will be teaching a course at Objective Standard Institute beginning in January. It's an 8-week, 12-hour course, and it's titled The History and Philosophy of Liberty in America. And we're joined by Eric today to chat with us about that course and about who should take it, who it's for, and some of the content, or at least an indication of some of the content. So welcome, Eric. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. Looking forward very much to the course. There's a lot of exciting things to talk about in that course. So yeah.
Cool. Well, I have a special memory of the many lectures of yours that I've attended in the past at various philosophy conferences. And you and John Lewis, our great late friend John Lewis, are two of the people who would lecture on history in a way that I found so absolutely captivating. And I've never been that interested in history, particularly when I took courses in high school and college on history. I was just bored to death the way that they're taught. But you have this it's just like this magnetic presence in the way that you teach, and you just pull people into these stories about how things have unfolded. And particularly in this upcoming course on the ideas and the events that sort of shaped American liberty, and what is more important to understand in some depth than that subject today, especially given the chaotic situation in our political world today. So I just want to pick your brain a little bit about what this course will be about and who it's for. John, I know John does deep dives into various areas and aspects of history. He's really specializing now in intellectual history. So I'm sure he's going to have lots of questions for you as well. Let me begin with so I know in the description of this course, you point out that you're going to cover the major ideas and events in the history of liberty in America. Can you give us just an indication of some of those events first?
Sure. The broadest way to describe it, the conception of the course, is to think about this from the perspective of what is, if we had to sit down and enumerate the full range of what liberty means in a free society, what are the institutions and ideas that support that? And if we do that from a historical perspective, ultimately what that means is looking at everything from America's colonial period, when many of the ideas that set up what ultimately comes to be known as the American character or the American spirit, what were some of those foundational ideas that the settlers who came to the United States, or to the future United States, to the colonies, what were some of their experiences in the colonies? And then ultimately, how did that set up the American Revolution, which is a huge event? That's probably the big starting event for us in this course, is the American Revolution, the ideas behind that, and most especially the institutions that set up, the kinds of government structures, the kinds of legal structures and political structures. Going forward, the story is, the particularly interesting thing about the story, and as it relates to the events, is that there are broad periods where different issues in that range of things that we would talk about as liberty come to the forefront. So in different eras, for example, just jumping forward a little bit, the progressive era in the early part of the 20th century through the New Deal in the 1930s and 40s is an era where it's very obvious that something like economic regulations, regulations over property rights, regulations over business activity become much more a part of the debate and a part of the change. But interestingly, so too does the right to free speech, something that's equally important today, but that for a variety of reasons that we'll explore in the course, the First Amendment as a hallmark of our freedom of speech and how that plays out didn't get to the forefront of American politics in the way that it would in the way that it is today until that late 19th century, early part of the 20th century. So even while we see the progress of something like the First Amendment and our understanding of it, there's also many other things going on. But just to give you kind of the greatest hits, the big events, obviously the Revolution, the growth and understanding of American politics in the early 19th century, the Civil War and the Reconstruction is a huge part of this story. The changes that took place, rightfully referenced by many historians as America's second revolution. There was a fundamental change that we'll explore in American constitutionalism that took place as a result of the Civil War and the aftermath. As I mentioned, the Progressive Era and the New Deal, and then as well, some of the big events that will come to play in the post-war period would be things like the Nixon years during a great upheaval in American economic and social life. There's a whole kind of constellation of those events, but it in many ways it's encapsulated in the big events in American history. So the Revolution, the Civil War, the Progressive Era, the New Deal, and the post-war Cold War era, and then looking with an eye to understanding some of the trends in the 21st century as well.
I know that this course is mostly aimed at young adults, and I'm wondering, a lot of these young adults, have recently taken a high school course in history, or maybe even a beginner level college course in history. What do you think is different about the approach of this course that people are going to get that they aren't going to get in another sort of course on history like this?
So I think that the unique focus of this course is a laser-like attention to the question of liberty and freedom. In a conventional American history course that you might have in high school or in college, that a young adult that this course is aimed for, what they will be studying typically, especially at that age, is a more comprehensive approach to American history, which is going to try to explore, in a course where I might teach that, I've taught such introductory courses in college, an introduction to American history. Those courses try to paint with broad strokes. They try to capture the social, political, cultural, legal, institutional developments really across the swath of American history. So you might be studying something in a course like that as broad as the changes in politics, as well as something like the changes in material cultures, for the advent of the automobile as a force in human life, which is a great story in itself. The changes in technology, or the changes in food production, even, the movement of agriculture from more primitive agriculture on into mechanized agriculture to scientific agriculture with the application of chemistry and other fields. All of that ultimately is a part of the story of American history, and a general course that most students would have taken at this point in their life aims to cover a lot of that. And so this course is very unique in the sense that although it may touch on some of those events, and a reference to those events and a knowledge of those events is important, the focus here is on a much more thorough and analytic approach to the question of what are the ideas and institutions that have set up the free society, or that have been eroded in the cases where the progress of society has been against freedom. So the focus here is really on one thread, a very, very important thread. In fact, I would argue, as we'll see in the course, that this is probably the fundamental question in American history, starting in the Revolution. What are the conditions of a free society, and how is it supported? And that's the focus of this course, that will go into more depth and more examination of what thinkers as well as what institutions came to support that, or how were they attacked in the cases that they were.
So you mentioned thinkers also, obviously, that this is really a look at the ideas that shaped the various events and this history. Can you give us an indication of both some of the thinkers and some of the philosophic trends that you'll be looking at?
Sure. The big one to start with is some of the influence of the Enlightenment on American thought. And this has probably the most profound effect on American institutions. America was, in colonial America, America was in many ways the child of its European forebears. There were influences of traditionalism in a sense of a broad Christian tradition. There were influences of the old monarchical system, the hierarchical society that had ranks and classes of society that had deference to each other. There were influences of a whole variety of institutions going all the way back to Greek and Roman times, through the medieval period, through the early modern period. But America's embrace of the Enlightenment in its scientific, political, and even more broadly, just its philosophic sense, was one of the major influences on this question about American freedom. So individuals at the founding, obviously figures like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, all deeply influenced by the Enlightenment and all deeply influential in their own right on American institutions. Into the 19th century, it's interesting that that legacy of the Enlightenment comes to play out in what I would call 19th century, a 19th century approach to reasoned government. That is, in the 19th century, in the early part of the 19th century, there were enormous movements to try to take that Enlightenment mandate of holding everything up to the light of reason and examining it anew again, examining it for the first time as if you were just looking at that institution, and reforming society in not a radical way in the sense of throwing things out, but more in the sense of by the application of reason. So some of the early legal thinkers in crafting America's legal structure, some of the early political thinkers in crafting America's political structure, used that Enlightenment basis, held that up and said, what can we understand about these institutions and how they best fit what we understand about human nature? Which was, as we'll see in the course, a radically new approach to those questions. Throughout the 19th century, two strands, that Enlightenment strand and what we might call the Romantic, or rather more broadly, the cultural strand. There were various other influences in the culture that emerged during what in European history, some might be remembering this from art history or even from other European history courses, the Romantic period. There was an influence of new philosophy coming in from Europe and even being developed here in the United States, that changed people's approach to the ideas of government and to the ideas of how to regulate a civil society. All of that came to a head in the Civil War. The Civil War was a time when traditionalist and even new ideas about how civil society should be ordered came head to head with that Enlightenment legacy. And that was, in many ways, the conflict that was with the deepest philosophic root of the Civil War. That what emerged from that was, as I said, a new approach to American constitutionalism that gave rise to both a new order in the sense of how the Constitution and related between the states and the national government and economic regulation, as well as personal liberty regulation. But it also gave rise to American philosophy in its own right, the pragmatists. And the pragmatist figures like John Dewey, Charles Peirce, and others became influential on thinkers in the public sphere about how government should be related. Building at the same time, there was also a distinctly new and very American flavored movement in American Christianity, or in real world Christianity, called the social gospel. So thinkers like Walter Rauschenbusch, for example, had a deep, deep influence on many of the journalists and politicians and legal thinkers at the time in the early 20th, late 19th, early 20th century. All of this ferment of new thought, both in philosophy and in religion, that was filtering down into the political sphere, gave rise to the progressive movement and ultimately to the movement that inspired the New Deal. And so for those who are contemplating joining this course, those are two momentous and really, it's a sea change in American politics and in American political life, American legal structures that takes place during those about 30 years. And to understand where America is today, to understand the debates that we're having in our politics, to understand the institutions that we navigate as citizens today, it's absolutely crucial to understand that period, because so much of what we are confronting today, whether it's something in foreign policy, whether it's something in regulating free speech, whether it's something in tax policy or economic regulations, or, I mean, gosh, even something so fundamental as debates about marriage equality, debates about all of these issues, come back to the way that 30 or 40 years figured out certain structures that have left a legacy for, really the last almost 100 years in American life. And the working out of those differences ultimately is how we can make sense of what's going on today.
Well, you preempted my next question, which was, I was hoping you'd say more about, what are the most pressing reasons for people to make sure that they understand these ideas today? How do these ideas impact the future of flourishing?
I think, so I preempted it somewhat, as you noted, but to add another layer to that, as I've been thinking about the course, one of the things that has struck me is it's important for us to understand today that there have been ebbs and flows, and that there have been gains and losses throughout American history in different areas of American life, in different areas of what we would call liberty. So liberty, in a very important sense philosophically, is a unified whole. You cannot have liberty in some areas if you don't have liberty in all the areas. So it's not as though you can say, well, I'm completely free to have, to exercise my freedom of expression, but I have no property rights, and I'm okay with that. Or I have free flourishing in the area of my economic life, but my thoughts are controlled. What we need to understand is that liberty is a whole. Liberty is something that requires an application throughout all the aspects of human life in order for humans to flourish. That's the unique relationship between human reason as our means of survival and the need for human reason to be liberated from government controls. That's a whole. But that doesn't mean that that's always a unidirectional, monotonic growth of regulation going in the wrong way, or expansions of freedom going in the other way. American history has been this fascinating, in a way, a fascinating tangle of some areas of our lives in regard to liberty getting much better, at the same time that other areas were getting worse. Again, there are some times when our practical freedom, I would give free speech as an example, our practical freedom, our ability to exercise our freedom of expression has become more robust, even though the philosophic understanding of it has gotten worse. So sometimes we have become more free in practice, even though the ideas supporting that have become weaker, which means that we're more at danger of losing those freedoms. And so I think that the real import of this course, to see the way that those trends have crossed and mingled and really just this mosaic of liberty in America, is what's going to help us understand the progress of human flourishing going forward. So it's what can help people understand, if things are trending today, are they trending in the right direction for the right reasons? In other words, are the institutions tracking with the better philosophic understanding of a certain area of freedom? Or is it that they're tracking in a bad way, but maybe some of the right ideas are coming out, and that we expect that to ultimately lead to freedom? So I think those kinds of questions for people, dealing with politics and legal institutions today, that's absolutely essential, because you can't just take a snapshot at any point in American history and say everything was more free or less free than it is today, and here's the direction it was going. We have to really take seriously the idea that there are broad trends that we need to capture and understand. If we're going to build that coherent vision of a unified idea of liberty and defend it, we need to know what that means, but we also need to know where it's come from, because the references that other people are going to be making when we engage them in the public sphere are going to be to some of that context. And so knowing where that's come from is ultimately how we can continue to push it in the right direction.
Cool. It sounds really, really interesting. The idea that there's a lag in, the way that ideas manifest at the political level, or in law, or in policy, is really important, because the connection between ideas and where the rubber meets the road is not obvious, right? And this is the thing that people have to understand if they want to advance liberty. You can't just deal with the here and now. You have to deal with the long range. It's the same as the principle, Bossier's principle, that there's the seen and the unseen, right? And there's the seen, there's immediate before our eyes, and then there's the unseen. What's the implication of these ideas down the road in political situations? So
yeah,
this sounds like a really fascinating course. Now, who do you see as the ideal audience for this course? Who do you anticipate and want to be signing up for this?
Yeah, I think that the ideal audience, from a perspective of the motivation, would be anyone who cares about liberty. I mean, in a sense, it really is as broad an audience as possible. People who could either benefit from a deeper understanding of American history in regard to the question of liberty, or someone who is just starting out in learning American history. It provides, I think, as I said, since the thematic structure of this is so fundamental to so many of our institutions, everyone from high school students that are learning American history for the first time in a deep way, to college students who are engaged in more specialized study of history and maybe now learning more about the economics or the politics and learning more about the specific structures, to interested adults, in whatever profession. There's not an area of human life that is untouched by this. And so in that sense, it's not particularly for those who might have a special interest in law or politics. It truly is aimed as broadly as possible, even though those are the topics we'll cover. The goal is ultimately for all of us to be able to understand how our lives in whatever our profession, whatever our avocations, is affected by this. So I think the ideal audience is, a young adult who is captivated by the story of America and wants to know more about how that played out with the particular perspective of how liberty and freedom have the course of liberty and freedom in that history.
Cool. I'm glad to hear that you mentioned that it's that broad, because interestingly, we've had 3 families just in this past weekend. 3 different families contacted us wanting to enroll not only the adults, the parents, but also their children in the course.
Yeah.
People asking for family packages and online cards.
No, I mean, and I think that is, I mean, and that's potentially a great opportunity, because in some ways that multi-generational perspective that those who take the course might have, I think is important. It's an important aspect of getting that historical view to some of these questions that students, high school, college students, can learn a lot from their parents, even though at this age they probably are less likely to think so. But in turn, I think those adults might learn a lot from their children and the perspective that some of that generation has about some of these questions, because the last 20 years of American life has, if it's taught me anything about how these trends that we've been talking about go, there are moments that are surprising, and they're surprising sometimes in very good ways because of what young people are doing in the world. And so I think that's an exciting thing about the future, and about the implications of this course are that those families have a chance to continue the fight for liberty into the next generation. And sometimes that next generation is doing a really amazing and surprising job of setting things up in ways that we might not have expected.
Yeah, cool.
So
John, go ahead.
I had one more, or a couple more actually, but this discussion of families taking the course together, it's really cool. And it kind of brings me back to my own experience with learning history, which was very, very poor. I went to the high school that the year I graduated was ranked the number one public school in New Hampshire.
Mm.
But I knew, I could tell you when the Declaration of Independence was written, and I could maybe like give you some rough dates on certain things. But beyond that, I was basically ignorant. And as a historian, this might be too nuanced, a thing to give a brief answer to. But I'm wondering how you think that the modern high school or even the modern college students' education in history compares to what people would have gotten, say, like 200, 250 years ago.
That's John. That's a really interesting question, and it draws back a little bit to something that Craig had said in the very nice, very nice things that he said about the courses that he's taken from me. I think that one of the problems and I have as you said, there's a lot here. There's a lot of nuance here, but one of the problems with the way history teaching is often approached is that it is approached as you described, in the form of ensuring content retention, that the goal of the teacher is to have the student memorize a certain set of important facts about American history or about European history or whatever the particular history might be, so that the hope is that they have the hooks, the structure on which to hang those important events and form a kind of civic knowledge about our country. The problem with that, of course, is not only is that kind of rote memorization and drill or kill kind of instruction not very effective pedagogically. It's not the way that the mind works per se for any large amount of information. You can learn very basic things through rote memorization. You can learn your times tables. You can learn. I mean, heck, you could probably even memorize certain important dates in American history. But it's not going to be the way that you learn history. Learning history is learning about how to think historically. And so one of the things that's been lost, although 200 years ago or 150 years ago at certain points, the goal of history was much more pointed and philosophical in the past. The goal of history was to learn and apply the lessons of how things have happened in the past. The proper approach to history that I try to employ is it's about stories, as Craig had mentioned. These fascinating stories that draw people in, that bring them back to the point in history. But it's also about that analysis. It's about not just grasping the facts, which is essential, that we have some mastery of those basic facts. So, if you don't know that the revolution came before the Civil War, et cetera, things like that, those basic facts are that structure, but not to the level of detail that is often taught. What's important is understanding the causative element and understanding why did one thing happen, before the other thing? Why did one thing cause another thing? And the ultimate answer to that is the ideas. What motivates human action in the past is the same thing that motivates human action today. So to understand the past, we have to understand the thoughts and ideas that came to dominate a culture or that came to animate a particular group of political actors. Why did the revolution happen? Why did the American Revolution happen? Because the American generation that experienced those 15 to 20 years leading up to the revolution, in their minds, had a complete revolution in their moral and political understanding of the right institutions for human life. And when they came to realize that their understanding of that was at a deep variance with the structures and ideas and institutions in their mother England, there came a point where there was a clash that separation became necessary. And they did so for intellectual reasons, right? They did so because their worldview, their understanding of the nature of human rights, the nature of government, the nature of what moral action in the world was, were at odds with those who were currently in power. And so they effected a revolution to solve that problem and rebuilt governments from that. The same thing is true. The Civil War, the ideas that grew out of the abolitionist movement created a new understanding of American government and its relationship particularly to the institution of slavery, as well as to the institution of state power relative to federal power, that the institutions of government changed fundamentally from the ideas that grew out of those movements, which were brought about by changes in thought. So if we're to understand those events and start to fix those dates as a kind of constellation in our minds of what our history is, to make sense of that, we have to make sense of the ideas and the events and institutions that grew out of them. Because otherwise, it would be tantamount to asking a student to watch a television show like in a foreign language and to memorize events in that foreign language. And you could probably parrot the words, and you could even describe the characters and the scenes, but you would watch this television show and you would be able to say what the events were from the beginning of the season to the end of the season, but you wouldn't really have any comprehension of it because you weren't actually understanding the words of the characters, the ideas of the characters. You actually have to have an ability to sit in their place and analyze. Given that someone thinks this, what kinds of actions are available to them? If you believe that slavery is a moral evil, that it is as some did, that it is a sin against the national idea of what America means, what are the actions available to you in 1859, 1860? That's a different thing from saying, if you believe that slavery is a biblically justified institution, what are the actions available to you? If those are the two motivating factors between two different sides, that gives you a context to understand why they took the actions they did, when they did. And so that's what history really needs to be about, is digging into the ideas and motivations, as well as analyzing the documents and the things that we have from history and understanding them with a critical eye. So to analyze, for example, the speeches, the books, the pamphlets, all of the expression of ideas in the past as well, we have to hold a critical eye to that. We have to ask the same kinds of questions. What's the motivation here? What are the ideas here that we would of a politician speaking today, of someone going to court and making a legal argument? In the same way that we interrogate and analyze that to say, what are the implications of those ideas? What does that mean for X, Y, and Z? We do that with the past as well. And that, I think, is the big difference in how to learn history in a way that is actionable in our lives, because the purpose of learning history isn't just to memorize all those beautiful facts. The purpose of learning history is to learn some fundamental truths about human nature and how the range of possibilities of action and how that can implicate our lives today. There are lots and lots of, philosophy and history are very deeply integrated. And as the expression goes, history is philosophy teaching by example. Well, there's a rich tapestry of examples that we can draw from, but we have to do the work to get the philosophy out of that and not just memorize the painting, so to speak.
Yeah, that methodological difference between just getting a broad survey and just having a basic knowledge of different events versus understanding like causal relationships, the things that actually made somebody do something. It really turns a key. It takes history from being, a snooze fest and not very relevant to someone's life to being perhaps one of the most relevant subjects that they could possibly study, because then you understand these are basic motivations. And it reminds me also of something that you guys do at Clemson Institute as part of the Lyceum program, where you look at history and also try to pull lessons about moral character from history as well. And I find that absolutely fascinating.
It's something, your experience, there was a point in my life, I think probably when I was in graduate school, when people were asking me what I was studying, and when you told them that you were getting a PhD in history or that you're a history teacher, the typical response is either, oh my gosh, I hated history, or someone might say, oh, I absolutely love history, but it's because they've discovered how to do history on their own, or they had a really great teacher, which is often the case. But it's a very love or hate kind of relationship. But I think which is too bad, because it almost made me want to not tell people I'm doing accounting, because nobody asks any questions about that. But because people would always be embarrassed. They would say, "Oh, I hated history. Oh, I'm sorry." It's like, no, it's okay. I understand. Like, you had bad history teachers. Here, let me tell you about why history can actually be great. And take my course, if it's someone that had that opportunity, and I'll show you how history can be fascinating and engaging and memorable. And so, it's and that moral dimension to it. It's the expression. It was actually a novelist who wrote this, but the idea that the past is like a foreign country. People do things differently there. But just as when you visit a foreign country, it's a lot more engaging if you learn about the culture and learn about the people there and can do more than just the touristy things, and you can actually kind of engage the culture. The same is true of the past. If you think about what were the moral constraints and the ideas and the texture of their lives, you can understand a lot more about how they made the decisions, which ultimately led to the events that you're learning about.
It kind of reminds me of anytime I've started a new job in the past. I've always come in, you're like young whippersnapper, and said like, why don't we do this and that? And then somebody will like, well, we tried that and this is what happened. And, if you think about history in that way, like there are all these lessons. If you know what's been tried in the past, you know what you can try in the future. It's really, really helpful.
Yeah, indeed. And it helps. I think it helps you navigate a lot of what goes on in the present. If you're paying attention to, I think probably I drive my wife a little bit crazy with this, but if you're paying attention to what, politicians and journalists and talking heads and people are saying in the culture today, they are often doing a very selective reading of history, or maybe they're even just ignorant of history, and they're saying things that I find I have a habit of not being able to not speak about, and this probably my wife doesn't always appreciate hearing my little mini lessons, but sometimes she does, so it's okay. But it's something where you don't have, and to me, I think it's the better that you understand the history, the better able you are to navigate what's going on in the present without always having to stop and evaluate and say, gosh, should I believe this? Should I not believe this? You have certain things at reference where you can say, no, I know that's not the way it is. Or, oh, yes, this is right. This person knows what they're talking about. And you can kind of filter a little bit better and equip yourself better to critically evaluate the proposals or the ideas that are being presented today. As you said, you don't have to think through the problem. Oh, we've tried that before. And someone might propose something. You say, no, like that's been done before. I know what the consequences are. I know what kind of choices that leaves people. Let's move on to the next idea, or let's not evaluate that as a real option.
Yeah. Well, I'm really excited about this course. I'm going to be in there myself for sure. And I encourage anyone who is interested in an integrated view of American history that focuses on the fundamentals and the essential aspects of this history, from the events to the ideas to the individuals who made a difference in this big American experiment that's still going on, incidentally. So all the more reason that we need to understand what has happened in the past so that we can make things better in the future. I know this class is filling up fast, and we've got families enrolling at this point. So if you're interested in taking this course, there is limited space. I urge you to enroll soon. It will be taught again in the future at some point, but coming out of the gate here might be one of the best deliveries ever. So, John, where can people register for this and how?
Go to objectivestandard.org and go to the courses page, and we'll also have a link in the podcast episode description, so you can just click that. But if you go to the objectivestandard.org courses, and you'll find this under courses, the history and philosophy of liberty in America. It runs January 7th through February 25th, and the times, it begins at 5:30 p.m. Pacific time, runs for an hour and a half for 8 sessions. So,
and you can take the sessions live, obviously, which is perhaps the ideal. But if you can't make the live sessions, all of the sessions are recorded, and if you're enrolled, you have instant access to the recorded videos. So you don't have to be able to make it to the live sessions in order to enroll. So, well, Eric, thanks so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And like I said, I'm very much looking forward to the course. It's an exciting narrative and a lot of exciting stories. And I'm sure a lot of interesting questions will come of it as well. I know you mentioned taking it live. It does afford the opportunity to ask those questions, to interact. I do like that interactive course. So I encourage people who can to do so live, because there is some opportunity to dive deeper on the things that really interest you as we're going through the material.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, gentlemen.
All
And
right.
please join us again next week for another episode of Philosophy for Flourishing. Actually, it'll be sooner than next week, John, because we're going to be talking to Dr. Raymond Niles about his upcoming course. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Just a teaser for the next episode?
Yeah, absolutely. Check out our discussion. It's going to be on Ray Niles's upcoming course, Henry Hazlitt Meets Ayn Rand. And that course is really just an integration of both economic and philosophic principles. And I kind of think of it like building a superpower, because it's one thing to study both subjects in and of themselves, but then to put them together and see how they all fit together is just a really incredible tool. So check that out. It's coming, like you said, sooner than a week from now. So keep your eyes peeled.
All right. Take care, guys.
All right.